ってきた。危ない。
My name is Harlan, and I've been a trucker for years, one of those who has driven through every corner of the country with nothing but the headlights as company. I've always thought that life on the road has its own rules, things only those of us who live on the asphalt can understand, things that don't make sense to anyone else. But what happened to me on this trip is something I still can't fully understand. I had worked for different freight companies, but recently I was finally able to buy my own truck. It wasn't new, but it was in good condition, and I got it at a price that, to be honest, seemed ridiculously low. I saw it listed in a truckers group, and the seller, an older man, assured me that the truck was in excellent shape, that he was only selling because he could no longer stay on the road. I didn't ask too many questions. It was an opportunity one couldn't let pass. Since it was my first trip with the truck, I wanted to take my wife and my 4-year-old son with me. It was their first time coming along, and I liked the idea of my son seeing what I do. During the day, everything was normal. We stopped to eat, the boy played with his toys in the sleeper, and my wife made sure everything was in order. But when night fell, something changed. As I drove, I noticed my son Matteo talking to himself in the sleeper. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just pretending like any child, but my wife turned to watch him for a while. "Who are you talking to?" she asked him with a smile. My son, still staring into a corner of the sleeper, said something that made my skin crawl. "With a lady." My wife and I looked at each other without saying a word. I tried to stay calm, not wanting to scare myself, but my wife pressed him. "What lady?" My son simply pointed to a dark spot in the sleeper. "She's right there in the corner. She's smiling at me." My wife didn't know what to say. She just told him to try to sleep. He listened, and we let it pass, convincing ourselves that he was joking or that it was just his imagination from boredom. But the truth is, it was strange and deeply unsettling. Hours passed and everything seemed fine until, in the middle of the night, Matteo suddenly screamed and woke up instantly, cutting our conversation short. My wife unbuckled her seatbelt and rushed to the sleeper while I kept my eyes on the road. "Harlan," my wife shouted in a tone I had never heard before. I quickly pulled over and went to the sleeper. Matteo was trembling, his face drenched in sweat, and he had a massive bruise on his arm. "What happened?" I asked, but my wife only looked at me with terrified eyes. She examined the bruise and noticed something chilling. It's a handprint," she whispered. I saw it with my own eyes, the mark of what looked like 5 fingers. My son sobbed, clutching his arm. "It was the lady," he cried. "She got mad at me." "Why did she get mad?" my wife asked, her voice shaking. "Because I didn't want to play with her." We didn't know how to react. We got him out of the sleeper immediately. I tried to think clearly, but something was very wrong with that truck, something that had no logical explanation. That's when I remembered how cheap it had been, and the other truckers' horror stories I'd heard on this very channel. I pulled out my phone and tried to call the man who sold it to me, but his number was no longer in service. That made me even more uneasy, so I decided to look up information about the truck. After some digging, I found something. The truck had belonged to a man who was murdered. His wife caught him with another woman during one of his trips and stabbed him inside the vehicle. When the police arrived, they found her dead in the sleeper. She had taken her own life in that very spot. I stared at the screen, shaken, then turned to see my wife trying to calm our son. That's when it hit me. We were traveling in the very place where a tragedy had occurred. Worse still, the woman was still there. From the moment I discovered the truck's history, the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was the certainty that we had been sharing space with something that didn't belong to this world. I tried to stay calm, but the image of my son pointing at the sleeper, seeing a woman smiling, the handprint on his arm, and my wife's trembling voice, it all replayed in my mind endlessly. I drove on in silence, stomach in knots, skin crawling, feeling like something was watching us. I didn't want to look back at the sleeper, but I couldn't help it. I felt that at any moment, I would see that dead woman smiling at me. I never told my wife what I had found. What could I say? That we were traveling in a truck where a man bled to death and his wife took her life? That the same presence that had hurt our son might be with us at that very moment? In the end, I didn't have to say it. She must have felt my fear, because at one point she looked at me and said, "We can't stay in this truck. We have to get out, now." I agreed, but we knew we couldn't just abandon the truck in the middle of the road. So we decided to finish the trip, but that night was the longest of my life. Every single second dragged on, and I felt the gaze burning into me from the darkness of the sleeper. When dawn finally broke over the horizon, I felt a brief relief, false security, like believing the danger has passed but knowing deep down it's still there. As soon as we reached our destination, I didn't think twice. That same afternoon, I sold the truck. I did it quickly, without explanations, without telling anyone what had happened. I couldn't carry that burden any longer. I got another vehicle, one without history, one without something unseen clinging to it. Since then, we haven't spoken about it at home. Not because we've forgotten, but because some things are better left untouched so as not to attract worse. Still, sometimes at night, my son jerks awake in his sleep, whispering under his breath. My wife says it's just trauma from that night. But I'm not so sure, because more than once, when I've leaned in to wake him, I've felt a presence, like something else is in the room. The same heavy, oppressive vibe we felt in that truck that night. My name is Safia, and I've spent more than 20 years on the road. I've seen it all, terrible accidents and things that defy explanation. But if there's one thing I've never been able to forget, something that still haunts me every time I turn on the radio, it's the last conversation I had with Lalo. He and I were road companions. We didn't work for the same company, but we often crossed paths on night routes and kept each other awake talking over the radio. Any trucker who spent endless nights behind the wheel knows how lonely the road can get, and hearing a friendly voice on the other side makes the journey feel lighter. With Lalo, there was always a joke ready. We'd talk about anything, from soccer to what was waiting for us back home. That night, we were laughing about a story he was telling about a client who didn't want to pay for a load, and everything seemed normal, until his voice suddenly changed. "Hey Safia, there's someone here asking for a ride," he said. I wasn't surprised. It's not unusual to see people stranded on the road, but at night, you always have to be careful. "Be careful, buddy, you know how things are out here," I replied. "Yeah, I know, but it's a woman. I don't know, she looks distressed, like she doesn't want to be here." He went silent for a few seconds, as if deciding what to do. Then, without warning, I heard the sound of his truck door opening and closing. "What happened?" I asked. I let her in. "Poor woman," she said her husband left her after an argument. Lalo then told me he'd drop her off at the next town and that he'd keep talking to me over the radio to make sure everything was fine. But something in his voice made me uneasy. I don't know what it was, but my gut told me something wasn't right. "Are you sure about this, Lalo? Does she look okay?" "Yeah, but she's quiet. Very serious." We kept talking about other things. I never heard the woman's voice on the radio, but I figured maybe she just didn't want to talk. Lalo was good at making conversation, and I was sure he'd try to make her feel comfortable. About 20 minutes passed, filled with awkward chatter, when suddenly the radio was filled with a strange sound. At first I didn't understand what it was, but when I listened closely, I realized it was Lalo crying. Not a normal cry, it was a strangled, desperate sobbing. My throat tightened as I called out to him again and again, but he didn't answer right away. Then, in between sobs, I heard him praying. He was muttering broken prayers, his voice trembling as if begging for help. I tried to calm him down and asked what was happening, but the radio only returned the sound of his ragged breathing and those fractured prayers. Then, a new noise bled into the transmission. Screeches. I can't describe them well, but they sounded like dying animals, high-pitched, distorted sounds that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't place what kind of creature could make such noises, but what terrified me most was that they seemed to come from inside his truck. And then, a scream. Lalo was begging for help. His voice was filled with a terror I'd never heard from him before, pure raw fear. Seconds later, a loud bang echoed through the radio, and everything went dead. I tried contacting him over and over, but only static came back. I tried everything, but I couldn't reach him again. I kept driving through the night, my stomach in knots, hoping he'd respond at any moment. But he never did. The next morning, I met some other truckers at a gas station. As soon as I arrived, one of them asked if I'd heard about Lalo. My blood ran cold. I knew instantly something terrible had happened. My body weakened as they told me he'd had an accident. He lost control of his truck and crashed into a concrete barrier. He died instantly. After trying to process what I'd just heard, I forced myself to ask the question I didn't want to: was there anyone else in the cab with him? They told me no, he was alone. The ground seemed to shift beneath me. I knew what I'd heard. I knew Lalo had let someone into his truck. I was there when he said it, when he offered her a ride, when he tried to start a conversation. It wasn't possible that no one had been with him. I went to the crash site, not sure what I expected to find, but desperate for answers. When I got there, I approached a police officer who was finishing up the investigation. I asked if there was anything unusual about the scene. He looked at me for a moment, as if debating whether to tell me something. Then he said the only strange thing was the way they found the body. Lalo's eyes were open. That in itself wasn't unusual. Sometimes the dead remain that way after an accident, but what struck him was the look on his face. He said Lalo's expression was one of absolute terror, as if he had seen something horrifying in the very last seconds of his life. I didn't know what to think. I had no way of explaining what had happened. But one thought kept repeating in my head: Lalo wasn't alone when he died. There was something with him in that truck, something no one else saw. I never spoke about this again with anyone. It doesn't make sense to try explaining it when I can't even understand it myself. But now, every time I drive at night, I can't help but glance at the shoulder of the road, as if, at any moment, I'll see a woman standing there, waiting, just like the one Lalo saw that night. My name is Gary. I've been a truck driver for more than 15 years, and I've spent more nights on the road than in my own home. At this point, I've learned not to get scared easily, because when you drive alone in the darkness for so long, you start to see and hear things you know are there, but you simply choose to ignore. However, there was one night when I couldn't do that. I knew that route well. It was a trip between Veracruz and Tamaulipas, a road that many truckers preferred to avoid because people said strange things appeared there. I had never seen anything unusual myself until that night. It was around 2 in the morning, and I had been driving for hours without rest. There wasn't much traffic, just a few cars now and then, and sometimes another truck in the distance. On both sides of me, only the road, the hills, and scattered trees that the fog made look even taller. At one point, just as I began descending a small slope, I noticed something in the hills to my right, lights floating among the trees. At first, I thought they were the headlights of a truck, but something didn't add up. They were too high, moving in a way that wasn't normal, almost like they were floating in the air. It wasn't the first time I had heard about those lights. Since I started in this job, I'd heard several colleagues talk about the famous fireballs. According to the locals, they weren't anything ordinary, they were witches. Old women who could leave their bodies and fly through the mountains as flames. I never believed that, but seeing those lights moving in such a way made my nerves spike. It wasn't just one light, there were several, moving through the hills at the same speed as my truck. I accelerated a little, but the lights kept pace, advancing among the trees beside me, as if they were following me. By then, the heat of adrenaline was coursing through my body, and I knew something serious was happening. I was being hunted by witches. And then I heard a thud on the roof of the trailer. It wasn't loud, more like something had landed gently on top of the structure. I checked my mirrors but saw nothing, only the hills and the lights, which seemed to be drawing even closer. My instincts told me not to stop, but my foolishness got the better of me. I slowed down a little and rolled the window down, trying to listen for anything outside. And then I heard it. A laugh. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind against the cab. It was laughter, but not normal laughter. It was as if many voices blended into one. A distorted whisper that came from above. Something was on top of my trailer. I floored the accelerator. The trailer box rattled as the engine roared, and for a moment, I felt something shifting up there. I refused to check the mirrors, I refused to look back, I focused only on the road ahead, on driving as fast as I could. The lights in the hills also began to move faster, but slowly, they fell behind. For a brief moment, I felt relief when I lost sight of them, but deep inside, I knew it wasn't over. About 10 minutes passed before I dared to loosen my grip on the wheel and grab the radio. I called out to see if any fellow truckers were in the area. I needed to hear another voice. Anyone on 180? I asked, my voice dry. There was silence for a moment before someone replied. I'm here, buddy. What's going on? It was a driver I knew by name but had never spoken much with. Have you ever seen anything strange around here? There was another long silence. Did you see the lights? He finally asked. Yes. Keep driving. Don't stop. Something in his tone made it clear he knew more than he was saying, but I didn't want to ask. I wasn't ready to hear the answers. The rest of the trip was in silence. When I arrived at my destination and parked the truck, I sat in the cab with the engine off for a few seconds, trying to calm myself. And then I heard one last noise. A solid thud on the roof. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, before I finally got out to check the trailer. Nothing unusual, just a few branches stuck to the top, as if something had clung to it before dropping off. Just when I thought it was over, another noise echoed in the cab. This time it didn't come from the roof or the trailer, it came from the passenger side door. I slowly turned my head and saw the imprint of a hand on the glass. It wasn't dust or dirt, it looked fresh, with elongated, unnaturally thin fingers, as if someone had pressed it there only seconds before. I didn't dare get out immediately. I sat in the cab, heart pounding in my ears, staring at the mark as if at any moment the hand itself might reappear. When I finally gathered the courage to get out and check, I realized I was completely alone. Since that night, I've never taken that road again. Not everyone believed me when I told the story. Some said I was making it up, others claimed it was just an illusion from exhaustion. But whatever it was, I saw it with my own eyes, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. Later, I heard other stories about that area, truckers who claimed to have seen the same thing, even worse. Some say those lights aren't just bad omens, but demons searching for lonely souls in the night. Thanks for listening. I've always believed the road has its own language. Spending so much time behind a wheel teaches you to read its signs, to know when something doesn't feel right. That night, I ignored the warnings. I didn't realize I had taken a road I shouldn't have been on until it was far too late. That day I left Monterrey with a heavy load headed toward Mexico City. Everything began at a gas station while I was having a quick coffee before continuing my route. A man mentioned a shortcut that, according to him, would save me at least 2 hours of travel. He said few people used it, that it was a quiet road with no traffic. I shouldn't have listened to him, but after so many hours on the highway, any way to shorten the trip sounded tempting. I had no idea I was about to turn onto a road that didn't seem to exist on any map. The first few miles were fine, the road wasn't in terrible shape. But after a while, things began to feel strange. There were no signs, no houses, no lights. Just the wilderness on each side and the growing darkness. I checked the GPS, but the map wouldn't load, as if the road wasn't even registered. I tried to ignore it and kept going, but suddenly I felt a tug on the wheel. The truck began to lose power until it shut off completely. I tried restarting it several times, but nothing. That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. I grabbed the radio to call for help, but only static answered. Then I tried my phone. I dialed 911 and, after several attempts, the call went through. They told me they'd send a patrol, but because of the location and distance, it would take at least 2 hours. I had no choice but to wait. I stepped out of the truck to check if I could fix anything, but I couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. Everything seemed in order, no overheating, no obvious failure. I decided to walk a little off the road to relieve myself. That's when I heard it. Screams. They came from the brush, beyond the roadside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I clearly heard what they were saying. It was the voice of a man screaming in pain, begging for help, as if someone were hurting him. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck and lock myself in, but another part of me couldn't ignore it. I walked into the brush, trying to locate the sound. I moved carefully through the undergrowth, keeping quiet. The screams grew clearer until I reached a small clearing between the trees. What I saw there will haunt me until the day I die. There were 3 men. I couldn't see their faces, but I saw what they were doing. One held another by the arms while a second forced a bag over his head. The third had a machete and I won't describe exactly what I saw, but blood was everywhere. This wasn't a robbery. It was an execution. I backed away, trying not to make a sound. My breathing was fast, terrified they would hear me. Just as I turned to leave, I stepped on a branch. The crack echoed through the night. The men froze. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their eyes lock on me. I ran. I ran like never before in my life. The scream stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps behind me. Someone was chasing me. I didn't look back. I sprinted until I reached the truck, slammed the door shut, and locked everything. I felt something outside. I don't know if it was paranoia or if they were really there. All I could hear was the echo of the screams replaying in my head. Minutes stretched like hours until, finally, I saw patrol lights in the mirror. When the officers arrived, they motioned for me to get out. My legs were shaking, but I managed to step down and tell them what I had seen. What they told me chilled me even more than the execution itself. One officer looked at me seriously and said, "Look, just leave. Your truck starts now, doesn't it? Then go." I asked how they could ignore something like that they had to investigate. But the other officer cut me off. "For your own good, don't say a word about this." I felt my stomach drop. That's when I realized what I had witnessed wasn't just any crime. The police escorted me back to the main road. They didn't even glance toward the place I described. They only made sure I left. When I got back to the main highway, I stopped at the first gas station I found. My hands were still trembling. Another trucker approached me, saw how pale I was, and asked what had happened. I gave him a brief version of the story, and his expression changed. He told me never, under any circumstances, to take unknown shortcuts. That those roads weren't on maps for a reason. And that I wasn't the first to see something like that in the area. I never took an unfamiliar route again after that night. I don't know if the men in the clearing saw me clearly enough to recognize me. I don't know if the police were involved or just too afraid to deal with something bigger than them. All I know is this: there are things better left unseen. And there are places where you're better off never stopping.